My wife apologizes, she lost her voice, so it was quite handy for me because A, I like to talk, so I do the presentation, and B, she likes me doing the things which she has at least partially written down, so we are both happy about that. I hope you are too. Unfortunately, you have to put up with only me, but you shall live. Good. Now, this symposium is about feelings, emotions, and moods, and we thus want to talk about the use of phenomenological investigation for educational purposes. We do that without the need of differentiating between emotions, moods, and feelings, i.e. we do not engage in a conceptual clarification of these terms because we set them together against the cognitions. It will become clearer as we go along, so please bear with me. Now, often enough, phenomenological approaches are dismissed because they are, supposedly, not sufficiently valid and reliable, and therefore, as Wheeler, for example, claims, in need of an additional natural scientific validation. By using the educational neuroscience proposal of Maréchal et al., we will develop the inherent limitations of cognitive, psychological, and neuropsychological approaches for educational purposes in terms of their systematic inability to account sufficiently for feelings, moods, and emotions in their experienced quality. And by highlighting the specifics of the educational field in relation to these limitations, we argue for the use of phenomenological approaches in education research, and that without the imperative of a subsequent natural scientific validation. Good. We want to achieve that by, in a first step, talk about the ENS agenda in relation to Chalmers' famous differentiation between the easy and the hard problem of consciousness. And as the ENS agenda, educational neuroscience, as the ENS agenda rests firmly on a psychology-provided bridge to connect the neuronal structure to experiential aspects, we, in a second step, will therefore evaluate the current psychology can actually provide such a connection, followed by a consideration of the explanatory limits of cognitive psychology in specific. Our fourth step will sketch out some characteristics of the educational field, i.e. that where education is supposed to happen, in relation to phenomenological investigative attempts, with recourse to Rombach's structural phenomenology and Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. We assess Wheeler's claim for an investigative priority of natural scientific approaches, and this allows us to conclude that the natural scientific approach is, especially for the specifics of education, not at all superior to phenomenological approaches. That makes sense so far, doesn't it? Do not. Okay, so let's start with educational neuroscience as outlined by Maréchal, Butterworth, and Tholm in 2013. Maréchal introduced the ENS agenda as an enhancement of the educational toolset to be proposed to make a reductive move towards the neuropsychological basis of educationally relevant aspects. Maréchal thus envisages a focus on educationally relevant cognitive functional states and structures, and B, to reduce these to underlying and observable neuronal processes and structures. Hence, the educational neuroscience agenda aims to provide an educationally relevant bracket that links neuroscience with psychology in the form of a cognitive neuroscience for educational purposes. It has been widely established that the ENS agenda works on three different levels of descriptions. I put them there on the right. which is A, physical, biological, and chemical processes on a neuronal level, B, a cognitive, psychological conceptualization of functional states, and C, educationally relevant aspects of action and interaction unfolding in relation to individually emerging meaning or sense within an educational context. The ENS agenda has attracted considerable criticism, not at least for me, because of its crucial role that cognitive psychology is supposed to hold in this account. Now, to get a secure grip on the underlying problem with these issues, we utilize Chalmers' differentiation between the easy and the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers focuses upon conscious experiences that are, quote, at once the most familiar thing in the world and the most mysterious, quote, end. Chalmers takes consciousness and science seriously, and that leaves him basically with two sets of minds, a psychological or functional mind, concerning itself with mental states and their role in a cognitive economy, and B, with a phenomenal mind, capturing the experiential quality for the experiencing subject. Chalmers explains that linking the psychological mind to its biological basis constitutes, quote, puzzles rather than mysteries, quote, end, hence the easy problem. However, when it comes to connect the psychological and the phenomenal mind, Chalmers' hard problem emerges. This is for Chalmers, quote, as baffling as it ever was, quote, end. It concerns the question of how to link individual experiences to functional psychological states as described by psychological science. We cannot follow Chalmers any further here, but it should be noted that Mareschal's ENS agenda has set itself the tacit task of providing an educational relevant solution to both of Chalmers' easy and hard problem. And this is nothing short of a very ambitious agenda. To gain a clear focus upon the actual difficulties, we need to speak a little bit about psychology and psychological attempts to tackle the experiences. So it would probably not be correct to say that psychology has not made worthwhile attempts to investigate the feelings, the moods, or the emotions. However, as Wittgenstein makes us aware, these states are supposedly private and privileged. Hence, they remain exclusively accessible only to the one who is undergoing them. And that makes it very difficult to capture and classify these motivating and or resulting affective emotive states over a group of individuals to incorporate them correctly into scientific, i.e., observer-independent assessments. Here we use three examples to highlight the problem by focusing on the psychological contextualization of these affective states, which do incorporate the complete realm from emotions, feelings to moods. First, the James-Lange feeling theory from James in 1888 supposed a set of typical changes which manifest itself physiologically. While the brain reacts towards these changes, the relevant emotion is experienced. Especially Solomon, but also Nussbaum, capture emotions, on the other hand side, as cognitive judgments. Hence, and we do not have the time to follow this up in any detail, we either have A, James's emotions as directed towards registered bodily changes and not towards that with what sparked the physical changes in the first place. Or we have Solomon's cognitive judgments not leaving much of a need for the feeling normally associated with the emotions, as the relevant work seems to be done already cognitively. So we do run a little bit in the problem here. Arguably, both accounts are less than elegant solutions to the problem of how to incorporate the emotions into psychological accounts. Second example on our list is Allport's perceptual set theory, which allows emotions and affect to play an initial role, providing a set or a template according to which cognition achieves an interpretive, intentional constitution, or Broadbent's early selection theory, on the other hand, who has selected sensory data, raising affective levels towards a stimulus, enabling resulting cognitive processing for an interpretive constitution. Hence, both accounts acknowledge the importance of emotive and affective influences upon subsequent cognitive processing, but they do so with an emphasis on the subsequent cognitive processing. Hence, there is a real danger that the initial affective or emotive episode may simply become invisible, as Sunderland calls it. Affect and emotion could thus enable a resulting cognitive representation, but they would otherwise remain ignored. As a third example, we have Scherer's appraisal theory, which focuses solemnly upon the emotions. He is basically using Arnold's earlier work. Scherer's emotion rate experiences against a set of previous experiences, appraising their individual usefulness or danger. Hence, Arnold's felt affective components can be directed towards an object or a state of affairs that caused the affective episode. Emotion could thus be intentionally directed towards something. Prinz developed this further, claiming that bodily feelings evoke balanced, emotional, and that is precognitive states. We can, again, not follow this up any further. Could talk a day about it, but you got the idea now that psychology struggles to incorporate feelings, moods, and emotions appropriately into its explanatory accounts. And these difficulties seem to increase when turning towards the currently predominant approach of cognitive psychology. So let's talk about cognitive psychology a little bit. Now, cognition does not only capture pure thoughts and inference, but also representational states in relation to sensory data used to control and guide behavior, while enabling thought and lingual report about objects and the surrounding world. With this focus, then, the term cognition is, especially in Anglo-American philosophy, used to set issues pertaining to perception, thought, language, and higher-level visual processing apart from other mental occurrences relating to will, feelings, and emotions. Hence, and contrary to Solomon's and Nussbaum's suggestion to perceive emotions as cognitions or as cognitive judgments, the current concept of cognition does not lend itself to incorporate feelings and emotions such easily. Cognitive psychology aims to explain how to understand the mind as a means to compute representational information following a syntactical structure to bring about a specified goal. Cognitive psychology tries to achieve this by designing experiments with larger samples of participants to equal out any individual idiosyncrasies and to assign participants to either an experimental group exposed to only one clearly specified stimulus within controlled environments or a control group that is not exposed to this one stimulus. Objective behavioral differences obtained from a third-person observer perspective between the two groups allow then the calculation of statistically significant differences or correlations suitable for hypothesis testing via the calculation of probability values for certain behaviors to occur or to causally occur in relation to a specific stimulus. Hence, so the overall idea, cognitive psychology utilizes inferences based on significant probabilities to substantiate claims about cognitive states and structures that must be in place to allow these causal links to function. However, there are two issues that need specific attention. The first one concerns the need to control the experimental environment in such a way that the causally relevant independent variable remains as little as possible confounded by other variables. But the more stringent an experiment's control gets, the more it loses its ecological validity, while a less stringent control reduces the generalizability of the results. One of my former students, bless him, overwhelmed by the sheer amount of confounding variables as they appeared to him in a seminar about environmental psychology, captured this dilemma by saying that all environmental psychology could ever be warranted to claim would be that a walk in the woods does you good or it does not. However, there is also a second issue. When it comes to the actual nature of the functional cognitive states, which are the subject of cognitive psychology, cognitive psychology itself remains ambiguous. Although the possibility to one day link these cognitive states to neuronal states is not explicitly ruled out at all, these reductive links have not been established yet. Hence, the target area of cognitive psychology, i.e. the human mind in its functional contextualization, is deliberately left ontologically unspecified. This brings us back to Chalmers' easy problem, i.e. connecting the functional cognitive descriptions to the biological stratum. This reduction of mental events to physical ones, if it can be achieved, would solve the easy problem. However, that would still leave the experiential dimension of life, i.e. the fact that we experience some of our mental functioning unsolved. This was, if you remember, Chalmers' hard problem, and we are now able to recognize that Maréchal's ENS agenda is mostly addressing the easy problem by trying to link cognitive states and structures with brain states and structures. The more challenging hard problem, i.e. fixing the experiential dimension of educational encounters to these functional states, is not sufficiently acknowledged by the proponents of the ENS agenda. But this is a critical omission, as it is impossible to add a few sprinkles of emotions, feelings, or mood onto these functional states. These states are supposed to be necessary and sufficient to cause the observed behavior. Hence, they cannot be supplemented with an additional experiential layer, as this would lead to a causal overdetermination, i.e. all of a sudden we would have two reasons where the aim of cognitive psychology was actually claiming that one reason is enough for these functional states to emerge. So we would run into a little bit of a problem. It is equally problematic to presuppose an emotional, feeling, or mood dimension into the design of these experiments. Underlying design assumption of that sort, that, let's say, cognitive mediated behaviors emerge because of a more basic emotive or affective predisposition, may be nothing but a design decision made by the investigator, brought to the results from outside the empirical data, and thus begging the question. Hence, okay, I thought it was already time. Hence, when we can recognize that the ENS agenda is probably a little bit too uncritical about the limited explanatory reach of its very important stepping stone, i.e. cognitive psychology, in terms of the problem to produce valid and generalizable results that remain meaningful for actual educational purposes, and in terms of the inherent inability to incorporate the experiential dimension of human life in a meaningful manner. Let us now try to project these very general concerns upon an educationally relevant screen. Now, when we do apply Bourdieu's notion of the field to education, that leaves us with a complex, interactive entanglement where social actors engage. However, when applying a mere psychological lens, as we drafted it out earlier, we may miss the emotive importance of this social space, or, as Anderson calls it, the affective atmosphere of these locations and encounters. Current research by Sunderland et al. Claims that previously ignored or invisible sensory experiences shape social locations, while Stevenson argues that memory is essentially implaced and embodied rather than a mere internal propositional archive of psychological contents. It thus appears that tracing the educational field dynamics has to, by necessity, include the feelings, the moods, and the emotions as they emerge within the field of the educational Lebenswelt, as one that is always shared with others. Needless to say that any attempt to condense these rich and dense environments to cognitive psychological laboratory settings may end up with the production of more or less meaningless phrases similar to the ones that my earlier mentioned and dissatisfied student used. Education does you good, or it does not. It is possible to account for this interconnectedness of the educational Lebenswelt with Luhmann's system theoretical framework. However, that would run the danger of losing the individual, i.e. the one that education is about as student or as teacher. Therefore, we suggest to use Rombach's structural phenomenology here. Rombach's approach leads beyond Luhmann's system theory and is able to account for an alleged weakness of the latter. Rombach explains that the conceptualization of systems and structures can be confusing. Nevertheless, they are distinctively different. Die Strukturauffassung ist die Veräußerlichung die Systemauffassung ist die Veräußerlichung der Strukturauffassung. Die Strukturauffassung ist die Verinnerlichung der Systemauffassung. Hence, Rombach's structural approach appears to leave enough space to capture an effective dimension of classroom interaction as it precipitates upon the individual. This is so because Rombach himself explains, quote, die Strukturauffassung ist menschlich, die Systemauffassung ist mechanistisch, quote end. Hence, when it comes to the interaction within educationally relevant Lebenswelten, Rombach's structural conceptualization would allow a focus upon what Luhmann's systems do to the human structure. Rombach's human structure is one that is open to the tacit influences of the earlier mentioned affective atmospheres and individually develops in accordance with the structural sedimentation of Stevenson's embodied and emplaced memories. For Rombach, this continuous development aspect of the human structure is of key importance because of its kinetic and genetic implications it has on an individual structure's comportment towards its environment and, presumably, upon its underlying neural layout. Although this latter point is none of Rombach's concern, for us it is a noteworthy aspect in the light of the ENS agenda. We cannot develop this any further here, I will come back to it later, but we should note that Rombach's structural phenomenology may just offer an approach to investigate educational interaction without the need to control both environment and subject for investigative classificatory purposes, as this would change the settings and the dynamics. Now, this would leave us with a phenomenological approach, i.e. a scientific study of the phenomena as that what appears individually to consciousness. Husserl, in 1901, first developed this investigative direction, and although phenomenology has developed in many directions and various approaches, all of them are characterized by Luft and Overgaard as follows. A, the importance of the first-person perspective. B, the exact description of the experiences. And C, the importance of intentionality as a relation established between the object and the subject. Sorry. It is not necessary to develop these aspects in too much detail here. Nevertheless, it is important to note here that these paradigms are characteristics of all phenomenological approaches, and as we do focus on Husserl's phenomenology here, these paradigms are not exclusively limited to Husserl. Nevertheless, before one should start to seek for the surplus value that phenomenology may offer, it is important to see where potential opposition manifests itself. Now, to say that phenomenologically informed empirical research is, by now, an established and credible form of psychological investigation would be a blunt over-exaggeration. However, various proposals to utilize phenomenology empirically have been brought forward. Nevertheless, and this is where some considerable problems emerge, Husserl's investigations were mostly transcendental. They aim to investigate the necessary conditions for the possibility for something like consciousness to happen. Current suggestions to utilize phenomenology vary in relation of how it would be possible to turn Husserl's transcendental investigations in such a form that they could be naturalized to suit empirical investigations. Based upon the objectifying history of scientific psychology, favoring a detached third-person perspective, any kind of subjective, phenomenological and first-person account receives suspicion. Dennett, for example, focuses upon the aspect that not everything that would be relevant to the first-person perspective is sufficiently accessible even to the one who is undergoing these events, while Searle focuses upon the difficulty to experience something while at the same time trying to provide a description of these experiences. This criticism provides part of the basis upon which Mike Wheeler claims that any phenomenological investigative result necessitates a validation by a subsequent empirical confirmation in order to be accepted, while empirically gained investigative results are not in need of a subsequent phenomenological approval. Hence, due to an assumed fallible character of experiential accounts, Wheeler leaves empirical, scientific, psychological research in an arbitrary role to decide about the validity of phenomenologically derived results. Not good news, isn't it? This is exactly where our concern emerges. When we go back to our initial consideration of Bourdieu's educational field, Anderson's affective atmospheres, and Rombach's human structure, it turns out that scientific psychological investigations cannot hold the arbitrary role that Wheeler assigned to them. To make this a little bit clearer, we have first two levels of description marked by A, cognitive, neurocognitive, functional descriptions of mental events from a third-person perspective, producing objective evidence concerning the processing of representational mental content with an inherent experiential blind spot. Or B, experiential phenomenal descriptions of conscious occurrences in their felt quality from the first-person perspective, supposedly riddled with insurmountable idiosyncrasies and therefore not deemed to be sufficiently scientific, at least by Wheeler. And we have two levels of investigations, i.e. a scientific investigation producing evidence to develop explanatory accounts and theories upon empirical findings, in principle accessible to everyone, therefore deemed to be objective. And we have B, transcendental investigations determining the conditions of the possibility for a described event or property to emerge. Searle and Dennett see 1b to be inferior to 1a, and although 2b is arguably the further reaching paradigm, its validity depends, according to Wheeler, upon a 2a subsequent scientific validation. So, endorsing the view that human conduct depends upon a relational entanglement of a human structure with the world structure, as Rombach puts it, any such entanglement must include affective atmospheres as provided by feelings, moods, and emotions. But these are currently neglected by cognitive educational approaches. However, a relational entanglement as it yields its forming effects, i.e. learning, upon an individual structure, i.e. the student, must exceed the mere ontological grounding that ENS strives to establish. These concerns are what leaves the ENS agenda as being founded upon empirical psychological assessments of human behavior as based upon a reduction that neglects the individual notion of what Rombach calls the human structure in its situated interrelatedness. Last slide. Hence, incomplete and thus ignoring the essential character of what it is to be human in intrinsically social educational encounters. ENS thus settles for less than phenomenology. While Husserl's phenomenology aimed to reveal universal and necessary conditions for the possibility of conscious occurrences, ENS is left with an aim to establish the biological necessary conditions for the probability of some expected behavior to occur while neglecting the experiential dimension more or less altogether. While this may be acceptable for general psychological assessments of human behavior, and even, to a certain extent, within educational contexts, it is not good enough reason to accept the claim for an investigative priority of the empirical scientific method for intrinsically social educational situation. This even more so as any kind of individualized sedimentation of the influences of that environment upon Rombach's structure would alter these structures. Hence, with any kind of micro-level empirical assessment of presumably underlying neurological structures as envisaged by ENS, it would just not be possible to get out of the realm of mere contingencies, exactly because of this human individuality, which is, by the constant onslaught of this entanglement, constantly altering itself. We thus suggest a rethinking of the relation between scientific and phenomenological investigations to be one that follows Lippitt's, i.e. one asking, in the case of conflicting claims, which approach provides a better understanding of that what is to be assessed. Thank you very much.